So in order to understand why Saturn is so important to the occult, we first need to realize that the entire world has been worshiping Saturn for thousands of years. Since ancient times, people have gazed up into the sky and have admired the heavenly glow coming from stars and planets, and they attributed them to godly powers based on their effect on humans. Now, before the flood, Saturn was regarded by all mankind as the supreme god and ruler of the kings. Now, it's important to note, as I said before, that Satan really wants to be God. Occult researchers affirm that Saturn ruled the kingdom of Atlantis and became the divine ancestor of all earthly patriarchs and kings. Semitic civilizations referred to the god Saturn as El. The supreme deity was represented by a black cube. Ancient Hebrews represented Saturn with a six-pointed star, which later became the Star of David. Many esoteric researchers affirm that the name Is, Ra, or El is the combination of the names of ancient pagan deities, Isis, Ra, and El. The Greeks and Romans also worshiped Saturn as a cruel deity. They believed that after he killed his father, Saturn became the ruler of the universe for untold ages, and he reigned with his sister Ops, who also became his wife. And he's often depicted as eating babies. It was prophesied that one day Saturn would lose power and one of his children would kill him. To prevent this from happening, each time his wife delivered a child, he would immediately swallow it. Saturn has always had a negative, if not evil, significance. Esoterically, it's associated with man's limitations, restrictions, death, and decay. His name in Greek was Kronos, the ruler of time, and I'll explain how that's important later on. If you picture the Grim Reaper, well, the Grim Reaper originated from attributes of the god Saturn, because Saturn is represented by a sickle, the sickle which he used to slay his father. And with him also representing time, you can see how the Grim Reaper comes into play as your clock winding down. Now, the last thing I want you to keep in mind before we dig into the actual symbology is that Saturn is a planetary representation of a star. It is the black star. So, once you take all these things into account, the only logical conclusion that a person can draw is that Saturn is intimately connected to the ancient mystery religions of Babylon and is associated with Satan and Hades. If you look at Saturn, on the North Pole, there is a persisting hexagonal cloud pattern all around the North Pole. It's some kind of storm or something, but it forms a hexagon that's bigger than Earth. This hexagonal pattern is extremely important to the occult. So let's examine this closer and break down all of its parts and also what it can be molded into. Now keep in mind while we're going through this that I'm not making any of this stuff up. I'm just explaining to you where some of these occult symbols come from and what they actually represent. So if we look at the hexagonal shape, we can divide it up into multiple pieces and form various different shapes from it. Right off the bat, you can notice that the hexagon easily forms 6 three-sided triangles. Again, we have 6 parts and 3's surrounding, giving us, again, 666 symbolism. From here, we can begin to form a three-dimensional shape. By taking away 3 of these sections, you can see the formation of a cube. This cube represents a lot of things, but I want you guys to focus on the fact that this cube represents a prison, a box that we are trapped in, the matrix, if you will. This prison is the flesh that we are born into. It represents the sinful worldly dimension that we currently live in, that is manipulated and controlled to an extent by Satan. Just take a look at this giant glass cube that Apple put up. The Apple logo, if you aren't familiar, actually represents the original sin of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit. That's why it's an apple with a bite taken out of it. That's what that represents. It represents the original sin, the sin that we are all now trapped into, the prison of sin, the flesh that we are trapped in. And when you take into account the fact that it's in the middle of a glass cube, which symbolically represents the prison, you have the original sin behind the walls of this cube prison. Do you get it? Now, you may not have ever noticed it, but there are actually people who worship these cubes, and they're found all over the world. They are embedded into our society, everywhere you look. The Bible tells us not to love the world or the things in it, but Satan wants you to do the exact opposite. Satan wants you to love this world. He wants you to love earthly things. He wants you to worship the prison that you are in, the prison of the flesh. Now, when considering this cube and its satanic significance, also bear in mind that a two-dimensional cube is a square, and a square is also found all over the place, particularly in logos. Now, if we draw a line connecting the corners of the square, we form an X. Now, what does this represent? Well, think about a pyramid. If you were looking down onto a pyramid from the sky, you see what appears to be a square with an X through the middle of it. And an X is another representation of Saturn. I hope you guys are starting to realize at this point that all these different symbols all coincide with each other, and they all come back to Satan. Jesus was crucified on the cross, or on an X, deliberately by Lucifer for several reasons. But the biggest reason, in my opinion, was for Satan to trick Christians into worshiping him. Now, if you think that the cross, which is an X, symbolizes Christ, you're not entirely accurate. It actually symbolizes Saturn, which symbolizes Satan. You need to realize that God does not need symbols by any means. He is above that. If you want to see a symbol that represents God, go outside, look at a flower, look at the oceans, look at a mountain, look at your dog, look at your neighbor, look at yourself. Look into the sky, all around us. God made all of this. He doesn't need symbols. Satan does. And that's one of the main reasons why God commanded us not to idolize. You see, God is a whole lot smarter than Satan, and he saw this problem coming. Satan crucified Christ on a giant X so that when you go to church and you kneel down to pray in front of the crucifix, you are actually worshiping before a cross, an X, Saturn, Lucifer. You are worshiping before Lucifer. Now, I have some good news. In the scheme of things, it really doesn't matter. If your intention is to know Christ and to know God, then you will know God, and he will know you. Now, as is the case with most occult symbols, there are masculine symbols and there are feminine symbols. An X is technically a masculine symbol, just like a square is a masculine symbol. So keep in mind that the X and the square/cube represent Saturn. Well, if you look at Saturn, you notice an interesting characteristic. It has rings that go around the planet. Those rings can be symbolized by a circle. A circle is feminine in the occult, and an X or a square is masculine in the occult. You see, Saturn represents both masculine and feminine energy to the occult. And again, when you see a cross, like the Celtic crosses that have a circle in the middle of them, it's more Saturn symbolism. It just actually encompasses the feminine into the masculine sign of the X, which creates a duality type of symbolism. Now, let's jump back to the three-dimensional depiction of the square, the cube, which derives from the hexagon. If we were to draw a star, and remember, Saturn is the planetary representation of a star, if we were to draw a star using the hexagon, we will get a hexagram. It's exactly how it sounds. Hexagram comes from a hexagon. They all start with hex, which all mathematically represent 6. The hexagon has 6 sides. The hexagram has 6 points, so on and so forth. But the hexagram is the symbol used in black magic. It comes from the Jewish Kabbalah, Jewish magic. It is a symbol of dark summoning. For the occult, if you want to put a hex on somebody, or if you want to have a spirit come forth, this is the symbol that you would use. It is not. It never has been. It never will be the Star of David. Nowhere in Scripture is David instructed to come up with a symbol of a star to represent him or the country of Israel. When Solomon had the temple built, he used people from a town called Tyre. Tyre worshipped a god called Baal. Baal is another name for Saturn in some occult groups. This hexagram is a symbol of Baal or Saturn, not the Star of David. This is the seal of Solomon. It comes from the Jewish Kabbalah, and at that time it was Jewish magic with a K. It's all very subtle, but Satan can deceive people very, very well. Alright, so hopefully now you can see that the hexagram, which derives from the hexagon, is actually a very satanic symbol that is used in occult groups to summon demons. And what does it come back to? It all comes back to Saturn, which represents Hades. So again, still looking at the hexagon that is found on Saturn, which is where all of these things derive from, and keeping the same shape of this pentagram, we can see another familiar occult symbol that comes from these shapes. Now, to some of you, this might not make a whole lot of sense. You might not automatically realize what this is. But to me, this is where things get really interesting. This represents the square and compass. The square and compass of Freemasonry. Remember, the occult are obsessed with non-duality, masculine versus feminine, the masculine and feminine. And I showed you how it can be represented earlier with a square representing the masculine and a circle representing the feminine. In terms of Saturn, this comes from the rings around Saturn representing the feminine, and Saturn itself, which represents a cube representing the masculine. Now think about the square and compass. A compass makes a circle, and a square, well, makes squares. So again, you see the masculine and the feminine parts of the square and compass symbology of Freemasonry, which is also depicted and derives from a hexagon, which is found on Saturn, which represents Hades. Do you see how this all comes back? It all interweaves into each other, guys. Now, what does the square and compass have in common with the hexagram? They both come to a point. They both point both up and down. You've heard me say it before. In Satanism, they have the belief, as above, so below. Again, non-duality. Now, looking again at the square and compass, we also see hidden in plain sight the seal of Saturn. The seal of Saturn is 2 X's, and you can clearly see that the square and compass form 2 X's. Now remember, like I keep saying, Saturn is the planetary representation of a star. It is a false star, just as Satan is a false god. But that seal of Saturn, those 2 X's, represent Saturn. Satan, remember, Satan comes as an angel of light.